Right, our final speaker in this panel is Jas Nijjar, who's completing a PhD at Brunel, lifelong Southall resident, maybe third-generation Southall resident. I think a round of applause in itself. And he works with the monitoring group. I'm just going to round up this session, thanks.
It's okay for standing. Okay. Let me begin by thanking Gominda and everyone involved in organising this event. So, as mentioned, I'm a lifelong Southall resident, born obviously well after the events of 1976, 79 and 81, and someone who attended Blair Peach Nursery in the early 1990s. As such, I'd like to draw on Southall's radical anti-racist history to better understand our current moment. A moment defined by continuing institutional racism, intensifying police militarisation, and flourishing far-right fascism. I want to show how past racisms that materialised in Southall remain alive today, albeit in different ways. This is important because it reveals how the racisms of today are rooted in a frustratingly long history, central to which is the degradation, brutalisation, and resistance of Southall's Black and Asian working class community. Firstly, it's important to highlight that the events of April 79, i.e. the warlike policing of anti-racist protesters, the murder of Blair Peach, and the destruction of community spaces like the People's Unite Centre, all represent what Sivanandan called the racism that kills. Racism based on a traumatising display of state violence, ruthlessness, and disregard for human life that, of course, had been perfected in Britain's colonies. That violent and deadly past, with its colonial underpinnings, speaks loud and clear to the present. The belligerent policing that killed Blair Peach and punished Southall's community now materialises through a frightening mix of hyper-intrusive surveillance technologies, spit hoods, physical restraint techniques, batons, tasers, and firearms. These militarised measures of control are normalised in post-9/11 Britain and serve as some of the ways in which the overlapping wars on gang crime, terrorism, and so-called illegal immigration are waged, issues which are, as a matter of policy, linked mainly with Black and Asian communities. But Southall's history of struggle against the most extreme forms of state racism and violence also speaks to a present moment that goes beyond militarised policing. Southall, like other multicultural districts in London, is the site of relentless regeneration and privatisation, which have been hazardous to the health of its residents. Take, for example, the building of luxury apartments at a former gasworks site, and the cleaning of contaminated soil in and around that site, as well as the use of flimsy odour controls by private investors. These developments, a stone's throw away from Blair Peach Primary School, have increased pollution in the area, thereby causing a rise in asthma, chest infections, nausea, and other serious health problems amongst adults and children. Hence, racist and capitalist violence materialises through the spectacle of militarised policing and through the subtle but equally destructive politics of health and urban regeneration. Politics that put profit over well-being and ultimately life itself. So remembering Southall's radical history is an important political act because it adds vital depth and intensity to our understanding of the dynamic and deadly character of institutional racism today. And that depth and intensity strengthens the view that contemporary forms of racial and neoliberal violence are long-standing and systematic, rather than aberrations or anomalies. My second point is about the importance of Southall's radical history in exposing the relationship between state racism and far-right fascism. The police's unprecedented attack on the anti-racist protesters in '79 was in staunch defence of the National Front. Meanwhile, the confidence of the far-right that day rested firmly on the institutionalisation of Black and Asian communities as welfare-scrounging illegals, as criminals of one kind or another, and so on. Today, when considering immigration policies like the hostile environment, a policy that violates the basic human rights of individuals with and without permission to be in this country. When considering soul-destroying measures like indefinite detention in privatised immigration centres, and when considering the cruelty of deportation, the British state clearly emerges as a site where racism and punishment work together. Indeed, Southall itself was subjected to Theresa May's intimidating go-home vans, as discussed by Hannah Jones and colleagues in their important work. The crude deployment of go-home vans, of immigration raids, and other aggressive tactics is designed to strike fear into black and Asian working class communities. These measures also form part of a broader, cynical, and shameless attempt to frame migrants as out of place, as the source of all social and economic woes, and ultimately as antithetical to the so-called British way of life. But delving into Southall's radical history reminds us that the unrelenting obsession with immigration in popular and political discourse, an obsession which is entangled with other racialised policy issues, does something more. It serves as the lifeblood of far-right fascism. How often have we witnessed or been the targets of unimaginative but nonetheless demeaning insults demanding us to go back home? What this means for the theme of today's symposium is that the fight against the far-right is not a fight in and of itself. Rather, Southall's radical history helps show us how state racism sits at the heart of a rejuvenated, legitimised, and mainstream far-right in Britain and beyond. In doing so, that history guards against complacency by reminding us that resisting the far-right was and remains part of a much broader battle against institutional racism and the callous and deadly treatment of black and Asian bodies it authorises. Let me conclude then with three obvious but nonetheless pivotal points. The first is that Southall's radical history reminds us that racism is always political. This may seem obvious, but I think it needs constant repeating, especially since the push to personalise the political has perhaps never been as powerful as in today's neoliberal moment. A neoliberal moment which prioritises convenient debates about mentality, individualism, and self-help over policy, official procedure, law, and their role in preserving a particular racial, economic, and gendered order. Secondly, it's the fight against the politics of racism that unites African, Caribbean, Asian, migrant, and refugee communities in the struggles against the violence of counter-terrorism legislation, anti-gang strategies, immigration control, and the everyday abuse and torment that these policies legitimise. Southall's history reminds us that not only is state racism diverse, but resistance to it must also be a collective effort that rests on a radical and dynamic anti-racist political culture. And thirdly, 2 decades after Macpherson, 2 decades after a bit of social and political soul-searching, we're led to believe that institutional racism is a problem of the past. However, collective efforts to fight back against different but related state racisms are as urgent now as they were in 76, 79 and 81, not least because the racism that killed Gurdeep Singh Chaggar and Blair Peach remains all too alive today. Thank you for listening.